Saw this tweet from Alyssa Childers this morning, and gosh darn it, I had to reply because this really takes her level of obnoxiousness and just terrible reasoning to a whole new level. And we need to highlight and call out this kind of offensive garbage commentary. First of all, we start with the tweet from John Pavlovitz that she's responding to. He says, I've had paper cuts that took longer to heal than Erica Kirk. So he's attacking a widow, which is disgusting. And I think that is absolutely abhorrent. And that just shows the toxic effect of social media and profound polarization in society when he makes comments like this. Despicable, and he should be called out for it. So, to that degree, I agree with Alyssa Childers. Everything else, however, that she has to say is offensive garbage. She says, I've received a lot of criticism for saying progressive Christianity is a different religion. I think I was being too kind. This is undeniably evil. Evil. Don't forget, Pavlovitz literally wrote a book called If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, Finding a Faith That Makes Us Better Humans. For the record, not all progressive Christians are operating at this level of Antichrist. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, again, she's right to call out Pavlovitz as not just behaving in a morally grotesque fashion, but also fundamentally in a way that's inconsistent with his professed call to love others and not be a jerk. Absolutely, I agree with that. That's great. But let's look at the rest of what she has to say here. So, first of all, she reintroduces her core thesis. This is the thesis that she wrote her book, Another Gospel. This was the central claim of that book back in 2020, that progressive Christianity is a different religion than Christianity. And in this tweet, she uses this as an occasion to double down on that thesis. Not only does she double down on it, she actually tweaks her thesis based upon the Pavlovitz tweet. How does she tweak her thesis? Well, she says, I think I was being too kind. This is undeniably evil. Now, what's the referent for this? Well, on the one hand, it would appear to be the tweet from Pavlovitz. This is undeniably evil. However, it also appears to be referring to progressive Christianity itself because she's linking the Pavlovitz tweet to progressive Christianity's identity as another religion. She's saying, I think I was being too kind in saying it is simply another religion. Based upon the Pavlovitz tweet, she is now saying, essentially, it is an undeniably evil, distinct religion. And then she says this, for the record, not all progressive Christians are operating at this level of Antichrist. Now, let's be clear in what she's saying here. Yeah, she's saying essentially, I guess, not all progressive Christians are quite as evil and as much of an antichrist as John Pavlovitz. But what she never says is that progressive Christianity is not all antichrist. It is all evil, she says here. All of progressive Christianity is not only another religion, it is an evil, distinct religion. And all progressive Christians are operating at some level of antichrist, even if not all at the same level of antichrist as John Pavlovitz. And she gets all that from a tweet. From a Pavlovitz tweet, she concludes that not only is progressive Christianity a distinct religion, it is an evil antichrist distinct religion, although not all adherents to this distinct antichrist religion are as evil and antichrist as John Pavlovitz is. Yeah, we have to unpack this. So, her original thesis, progressive Christianity is another religion. The amended thesis, progressive Christianity is an antichrist religion, and so is evil. It is an evil antichrist religion. Evil. Well, in my book, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, I wrote this 200-page book deconstructing her insane thesis, her original thesis, that progressive Christianity is another religion. And I don't have time here to unpack the book. I'm not going to go through all the arguments here. I am going to give a surgical strike on her central claim that progressive Christianity is another religion. And then I want to conclude this video by coming back to her logic, her incredible hasty generalization from a single tweet from John Pavlovitz to the amending of her already insane thesis from being that progressive Christianity is another religion to the claim that it is a distinct antichrist evil religion. So, the way that I want to do my surgical strike is by focusing on this one individual that she attacks in her book, Brian Zahnd. She refers to Brian Zahnd at least these four different times in another gospel. First of all, on page 86, she calls him a progressive author, and she quotes him as saying, God did not kill Jesus, human culture and civilization did. God did not demand the death of Jesus, we did. And I'm also going to skip ahead to page 212, where she quotes him, and she says, Brian Zahnd says, Good Friday is not about divine wrath. Good Friday is about divine love. Now, the quotes on page 86 and 212, she's quoting Brian Zahnd here as a representative of this evil antichrist religion called progressive Christianity, according to her. And what she's actually quoting him here as saying is making critical comments on what we call penal substitutionary theory, which is a distinct theory of the atonement that is held by conservative Christians like Alyssa Childers, but which has been widely rejected by other Christians, including Protestants, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. But because people like Alyssa Childers are simultaneously so ignorant and so sectarian, they assume that if you don't accept their theory of atonement, penal substitution, you are a member of a distinct religion and an antichrist religion. You've rejected the gospel itself, according to her, because you reject penal substitutionary theory of atonement. But then, of course, that would indict not just Brian Zahnd, it would indict millions of Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants globally who also reject penal substitutionary atonement. And please be clear here for you penal substitutionary atonement folk. Substitutionary atonement is not the same thing as penal substitutionary atonement. The fact that people reject penal substitutionary atonement does not entail that they reject substitutionary atonement simplicator. Okay, let's be clear on that. Page 159, she quotes him again, refers to him as progressive pastor and theologian. And here, the thing she seems to highlight at the bottom of this quote is one of the assumptions of the ancient Israelites was that Yahweh shared the violent attributes of other deities worshipped in the ancient Near East. But Zahnd says these assumptions were inevitable, but they were wrong. In other words, Zahnd says that he believes the ancient Israelites had some false beliefs about God. That is, for Alyssa Childers, evidence again that he's a member of a distinct antichrist religion. And then on page 184, she quotes him as saying this. Jesus certainly did not lay the foundation for the afterlife theology that claims all non-Christians go to hell. This has become a common way of thinking about heaven and hell. Christians go to heaven, non-Christians go to hell, but it's not based on anything Jesus ever said. She quotes that as further evidence of him being an adherent to an antichrist religion that is completely distinct from Christianity. But of course, what Brian Zahnd is doing here is simply pointing out that Jesus taught things like the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25:31 to 46, which I would really commend, Alyssa, that you read the Bible, you read the Gospels, you read Matthew 25:31 to 46, and you'll see here that Brian Zahnd is actually not teaching anything other than what Jesus taught. You should familiarize yourself with it. I think it would do wonders for your ministry. So here is Brian Zahnd. This is one of his recent books, The Wood Between the Worlds, A Poetic Theology of the Cross. Now, interestingly, this book was voted a Christian Book Award finalist, and it is published by the evangelical Christian publisher InterVarsity Press. I bet that they would be really interested to know that this book was nominated for a Christian Book Award when, in fact, the author is not a Christian at all, but is, in fact, an adherent, a leader in an antichrist distinct religion that is evil. I bet that all the Christian leaders who endorsed his book would also be interested to know that, according to Alyssa Childers, Zahnd is not a Christian at all, but rather is a leader of a distinct antichrist religion that is evil, called progressive Christianity. See, that's how insane Alyssa Childers is. That she's claiming that Brian Zahnd, and she has the same thing about multiple other individuals who identify as progressive Christian or who she labels progressive Christian. Because here's the interesting thing: Brian Zahnd himself doesn't even use the term progressive Christian to refer to himself. I've talked with him about this. He says, yeah, I don't use that term for myself. Here's the church that Brian Zahnd founded in 1981. It's called Word of Life Church, and he's been the minister there ever since. And if you look down there in the parking lot, you see a silver Chevy Camaro, which is kind of cool. I'd like to think that that's Brian Zahn's car, because of course that's what a an evil antichrist progressive Christian leader would drive. They would drive a Camaro. This is from the website of Word of Life Church. Our aim is to be an authentic expression of the kingdom of Jesus in the 21st century. With its roots in the Jesus movement of the 1970s, Word of Life Church, planted in November of 1981 by Brian and Perry Zahnd. And then it goes on and describes the church moving into the 21st century, and frankly, now a quarter of a century through the 21st century, aiming to be an authentic expression of the kingdom of Jesus. Gosh darn it. Those progressive Christians are so wicked that they actually try to sound like Christians. Huh. Well, if you look on the website for Word of Life Church and you find out what their beliefs are, they have two beliefs. First of all, the Apostles' Creed, and second, they have the Nicene Creed. This is how evil progressive Christian people are, that they even share the same creeds that Christians share. They profess the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and that's how nefarious these antichrists are. Of course, this is all insane. Uh, Brian Zahnd is just a good old-fashioned Jesus follower. He's a Christian who came out of the Jesus People movement. And Alyssa Childers is a sectarian MAGA fool. And yeah, that's what she is. She claims not only that Brian Zahnd is an adherent of a distinct religion, but that that distinct religion is an antichrist religion and is evil, which again is insane. And now, as I conclude, I want to come back to the way that she doubled down on her original thesis and reified it and made it even more robust. Essentially, this is another Gospel 2.0. So, as we saw, she said, based upon this Pavlovitz tweet, she said, you know what? Not only is progressive Christianity another religion, it is a distinct antichrist evil religion. Okay. Uh, Piers Morgan recently had Nick Fuentes on his show. Now, Nick Fuentes is would identify as well, he's a neo-Nazi, and he's become very popular among a lot in the MAGA movement now. He is an unapologetic white supremacist, neo-Nazi misogynist, and he has become a hero, was recently featured on Tucker Carlson, and has now been promoted by Piers Morgan. But now Piers Morgan is actually unhappy with Nick Fuentes. And so he tweeted, you really need to get laid, you deluded little twerp. And then Steven Crowder retweets Piers Morgan and makes a reference to the fact that Piers Morgan identifies as a Catholic. And he says, how Catholic of you. And I guess based upon uh, Alyssa Childers' logic, if John Pavlovitz, one tweet from him warrants us in concluding that not only is her insane thesis still true according to her, but we now have warrant to tweak it to say that progressive Christianity is an evil antichrist religion. Well, then I guess based upon a single Piers Morgan tweet, we have reason to conclude that Roman Catholicism is a sexually libertine movement that encourages people who are deluded to get laid, quote unquote. Now, of course, Crowder is identifies as an evangelical. And I'm not going to waste our time here looking at all the despicable things Crowder has said. But if you can define progressive Christianity, quote unquote, based upon John Pavlovitz's social media output, well, then I guess you can define evangelical based upon Stephen Crowder's social media output. And one other person that I saw just this morning from a post from yesterday, uh, Josh Webben or Joel, sorry, Joel Webben or Weben. He's one of these guys that is a frequently gets identified as making despicable comments about endless lists of groups, including here the LGBT community. So I guess that we can also define conservative Christians based upon Joel Webben and Stephen Crowder, just like Alyssa Childers identifies progressive Christians based upon John Pavlovitz. And so when we do that, when we identify all of um, the evangelical and Christian movement based upon people like Crowder and Webben, well, I think that we can say that this is pretty much an antichrist evil movement. Evangelical Christianity is antichrist and evil. So I want to thank Alyssa Childers to conclude for showing us that evangelical Christianity is, in fact, an evil antichrist, distinct religion from Christianity based upon the social media output of people like Crowder and Webben. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for your helpful work in this regard.